All right, why don't we begin? My name is Danielle Spiegelfeld. I am the Executive Director of the Guarini Center in Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event on energy policy in the Biden administration. As many of you know, President Biden has pledged to pursue a starkly different energy policy than his predecessor. He's made the reduction of greenhouse gases a priority, including by putting the US on a path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and has already taken some bold actions towards that end, such as the decision to revoke the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. The question before us now is, what other actions can we anticipate in the near term, and how impactful will these policies actually be in shepherding a new energy landscape for the US? It's a big topic with a lot of complicated components, so I won't waste much time, but I do want to briefly introduce our panelists. First off, we have Bethany Noll, Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center here at NYU Law, my colleague. We also have Margaret Peloso, who's a partner at Vinson and Elkins, Stephen Richardson, a Senior Managing Director at Evercore, Starla Ye, Director of Policy Analysis Group, Climate and Clean Energy Program at NRDC, and Robert Sieber, who's a partner at Vinson and Elkins, as well as an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. Robert will be moderating the panel today. Before I hand it over to Robert, I just want to thank him for all of his continued support for the energy program at the law school and for partnering with us in putting this event on. We've all learned a great deal from Robert over the years and are so grateful for his support as well as that of Vinson and Elkins. One administrative detail before I hand it over for good, and that is that we would be very happy to hear from you during the event. You can use the chat function to provide commentary, put up links to other sites, et cetera, and so forth. And you can also submit questions that you would like Robert to ask the panelists towards the end of the program by using the Q&A function. So we're looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Robert. Off to you.
Well, thank you, Danielle. Thank you all for joining us here today. Welcome. As Danielle said, this is now actually the 6th time that we have a panel of this kind on energy policy in conjunction with the NYU Guarini Center. It has always been a pleasure, and it has been a pleasure to coordinate this with Danielle. Of course, this is the first full time that we are doing this in the virtual format. Since I'm a lawyer, as are some of my panelists, I can assure you that we checked the Zoom filter very carefully, and so that nobody on our panel will have to say I'm not a cat. Danielle introduced the panelists, so we want to jump right into it. You all know that there has been a record number of executive orders coming out of the White House on the first day and in the first few days of the Biden administration. There are 2 particular executive orders that lay out the broad strokes of the forthcoming energy policy. One was signed on January 20th, and it has the title Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. The second one came out on January 27th, and it has the title Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. It is already clear from the title, and even clearer if you dig into them, that the cornerstone of the energy policy program of this administration will be climate change, or as both executive orders call it, the climate crisis. And the executive orders lay out a program that falls into two themes or 2 buckets. One is new initiatives, and the other one is to reverse actions taken by the prior administration. As Danielle indicated, the ultimate goal is for the US to achieve a carbon pollution-free electricity center no later than 2035, so that's 14 years out, and to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050. These are clearly goals that require actions that present a presidential term. So one of the aspects that we want to discuss here today is, well, what does it take to make this permanent, and what are the obstacles to do so? Now, when you look at those goals and you look at the executive actions, it's equally important to point out what's not there. Every president since the 1970s took office with a pledge to achieve energy independence. Presidential campaign after presidential campaign, discussed energy independence, and that has always been on the forefront of presidential candidates and incoming presidents. Well, that is no longer the case, and the term doesn't even appear in any of the executive orders. So the energy policy goals have shifted in a very dramatic way. So with that background for everybody's benefit, I want to turn to our panel, and I would like to ask Starla first, since she's with an environmental organization and coming strongly from an environmental perspective. If you look at those executive orders, they are a huge canvas, very broad goals, very broad programs. And within that broad canvas, what would you consider to be the priorities, both in terms, what would you like to see the priorities, and what do you think would be, will the administration view to be the priorities? Starla is, if I may disclose, Starla is joining us from New Hampshire.
Thank you so much, Robert and Danielle, for the opportunity to speak today, and it's a pleasure to join my fellow panelists. As Robert and Danielle, I think, have set up very well, I think, from NRDC's perspective here, we are really at a pivotal and unique moment. There are a confluence of dynamics happening, including clean energy is affordable now, and it's reliable. The urgency of the climate crisis has been recognized by the administration. Transportation and building electrification are happening. Momentum is building on that front. And we're putting environmental justice and equity at the forefront. So all of these dynamics, I think, are giving us a really good opportunity to take this upcoming decade and make some really important and critical actions. The 2020s decade is going to be a deciding threshold for the ability to meet the 2030 and 2050 targets. We are going to need to make a ton of progress and really keep up the momentum through 2030 in order to meet the Biden administration's goals to clean up the electricity sector by 2035 and to meet the net zero emissions goal by 2050. It's going to take swift and sweeping federal action, including both congressional actions as well as administrative actions. And that all will need to be shored up by state and local actions as well. I've observed along with my team and our analysis that in order to be well positioned to limit global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that has been set forth in the IPCC report, which is a critical level to managing the worst impacts of climate change, the US must be on track to reduce economy-wide GHG emissions effectively to zero by 2050. So this is a critical point, and one that the Biden administration has recognized. And in order to be in a position to meet that goal, the US really needs to make ambitious and steady progress before 2030. So NRDC is going to be calling on the administration to take action that addresses emissions in all parts of the economy. So for example, in power, we're looking at standards that will address CO2 and other emissions from power plants. This will include hazardous air pollutants, public health emissions, as well as congressional action to support a clean energy standard, innovation, tax credits through stimulus and such. Well, another important component of this is going to be FERC action. that will support the market shifts, that will drive additional decarbonization of the power sector and will enable a lot of the technologies like renewables and storage to be properly valued from the perspective of the electricity grid. We'll also be asking for and supporting in the transportation sector standards for fuel economy, congressional action to support tax credits, EV sales, and accelerated turnover programs for vehicles, a little bit in the sense of cash for clunkers, if you all will recall that program. Similarly, for buildings and electric and industry, there will be a strong push for harnessing all cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities, as well as electrification, as well as forward planning for the sectors and segments of industry that we know are hard to decarbonize, like petrochemicals, cement, and then aviation is another key sector that we know is going to require some additional solutions going forward. This will all need to also include a lot of policy development on the natural solution side. That means land sinks and developing federal support to expand those and expand the potential for carbon reductions from those, in addition to policies that will prevent the building of pipelines and preserve natural lands. All of this is going to take unprecedented levels of planning, policy development, infrastructure, permitting, construction activity. And we do see a major opportunity for all of it to be driven by clear federal, state, and local policy signals. There will be a strong role for policy to play to address the challenges, for example, in shaping consumer behavior, aligning natural stock retirement schedules to meet the 2030, and you might consider 2035, as well as 2050 long-term goals. I'll close by saying that the 2020s decade we are really seeing as an opportunity, but we know that there are a series of actions that we need to take and we cannot delay on them. It's going to take an unprecedented level of effort to meet the campaign goals and the administration goals set out by the administration. And this is the time. This is a pivotal moment for us to take the no regrets actions, and NRDC is very much looking forward to being there to support the needed policies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Starla. I hear it. I hope it's only on my end, not on yours. Well, you know, I asked what are the priorities within that broad canvas. I have the feeling the canvas has not shrunk, which is probably a good segue to Maggie, my partner Maggie, who is in Washington and deals with what I would view as the political realities. So Maggie, from your perspective, if you look at the broad program that Starla outlined here, what will it take realistically? And you know, what is congressional action, what is regulatory actions, and what will be some of the obstacles?
Sure, thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me. First off, I absolutely agree with Starla that we will need strong federal leadership to meet the Biden administration's climate goals, and that's likely to take a number of different forms. You know, I think starting at the legislative front, that is where things might be tricky given the Democrats' narrow majority in the Senate. I would note that the COVID appropriations bill that passed at the end of December did have quite a lot of money in it in an energy-specific title related to trying to enhance wind energy, solar energy, carbon management, carbon capture. So Congress has made a financial commitment there that I think is important to signaling the willingness to support the energy transition, but alone it's not going to be sufficient. When you start to dig into some of the levels of support for individual technologies, they're not necessarily going to be enough to be meaningful and move the needle, but there's also quite a lot in there to have DOE studies and sponsorship and support that I think will be impactful. On the legislative side, the one other thing that we do see that is likely to happen is an infrastructure bill, probably sometime later in the year. I have a lot of questions about how an infrastructure bill might consider the energy transition and the role of climate in that. So for example, might you think about transmission infrastructure as being an important piece of that infrastructure, or storage infrastructure, some of the things that you need to really get to decarbonizing the grid in a meaningful way. You know, when you step back from the legislative piece of it and start to think about what can the Biden administration do without legislative action, I think there are two sort of separate and important buckets that we'll see. The first is, of course, what's going to happen at the EPA. The Biden administration has signaled that they want to take a whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis, which I think means we will see a much broader approach to how and where climate is addressed, as opposed to having everything happen at EPA. That is evidenced through Biden's staffing in the White House, and also, frankly, staffing in the individual agencies. There are many agencies like the SEC that have some climate dedicated positions that are new in this administration. Within the EPA, we will certainly see the revisiting of some of the Trump era rules, particularly ones that have been invalidated in courts, such as the DCC's recent invalidation of the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which invites the EPA to go back and look at greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants. We already know that the administration has asked the EPA to go back and look at methane rules for natural gas production. And importantly, there has asked for standards for existing sources, not just new sources. So that could bring in quite a bit of additional methane control. I think perhaps the more interesting question here will be, what are the financial regulators going to do in the Biden administration, and how might that impact the energy industry and the energy transition? The current acting SEC Commissioner, Allison Herron-Lee, has written quite extensively on the need for the SEC to demand more transparency from companies around their climate commitments. And the CFTC last year issued a report concluding that climate change is a threat to the global economy. Janet Yellen signaled in her confirmation hearings that the Fed will take a look at climate. So I think there's a bunch of really interesting open-ended questions around how that might work and how that will play into pre-existing trends where you have a lot of ESG motivated capital, both in lending and in investing, that is really looking to understand climate impacts and to invest in the low carbon transition. And I'll leave it there for right now.
Well, thank you, Maggie. We are about 20 minutes in. I'm not sure whether anybody has used the words oil and gas yet. And you know, if you think back 12 years when the Obama administration took over, while not as ambitious as the Biden program, it was also ambitious about climate change and clean technologies. And then it was actually President Biden who witnessed the peak of domestic oil and gas production in the history of the country. So I want to turn now to Steve, who is a close follower of the oil and gas industry, and ask, well, how does the domestic oil and gas industry fit into all of this, and what has already happened in the marketplace, and what do you think will happen in the coming years?
Great, happy to. Thank you, Robert, and thanks to the Guarini Center for hosting. Happy to be here today. I think there's really two pieces of it. In terms of the market, I'd say what we're already seeing, and maybe not as aggressively as it needs to be, but what we are seeing is, you know, wholesale acceptance and, you know, really, capitalization of alternative energies in all forms. So, you know, to some extent, if you think back to even before this administration, you know, a lot of the as we like to say, the terminal value concerns that people had either about long-term oil demand and long-term natural gas demand and hydrocarbons in general was already being manifest in the capital markets. And so I think what you're seeing today is obviously just huge inflows into not only the broader rubric of ESG funds, but, you know, capitalizing, you know, a multitude of technologies, be it on the EV side, be it on carbon capture, hydrogen. And so, capital markets are very much moving in the ways in which, Maggie and Starla just described in terms of a lot of things that need to happen, which I think is relatively optimistic. I'd agree with Maggie that a lot of us are waiting on this infrastructure bill. And I think, our view is this will be a $2 trillion piece of legislation. And we will start hearing about it, shortly after, in actually, not too distant future. And I think if you think about the Recovery Act of 2009 as a bit of a template, I think there were a lot of incentives and improvements that were brought, particularly in the utility sector, in terms of encouraging a lot of shifting. And there's no doubt that there's a desire here to go a little bit more aggressively. So from the market perspective, I think we're seeing a huge the market's kind of doing its job in the near term in terms of providing low cost of capital to alternative energies and renewables, and to be frank, putting a lot of struggles on some of the conventional oil and gas. And I guess that's probably the thing I can talk about the most specifically. And in terms of the domestic oil and gas industry, as you mentioned, Robert, the goal of energy independence, which was kind of set in the 70s, this industry achieved, almost despite government policy or federal policy, certainly. I mean, there was a number of incentives in the tax code that certainly helped this industry grow over time. And the key beneficiaries of that have been, the balance of payments, the strengthening U.S. dollar, and a broader dividend to U.S. consumers, and obviously some localized benefits in oil and gas states. As I mentioned before, this industry was also, it's important to realize, under quite a bit of pressure to change before, January the 20th, right, and before the election. We've got a situation where we grew a U.S. oil supply from 7 million barrels a day to 14 million barrels a day, and from a market's perspective, shareholders didn't get a lot of benefits from that. And I think that's that we've seen kind of a change of industry dynamic towards a more balanced returns and growth profile to accommodate kind of market demands. But I also think you've seen obviously a huge amount of consolidation amongst the independents in the U.S. So think about larger, lower growth entities. And we've also seen, the pullback of a lot of private equity, a lot of private capital, a lot of international capital from the oil and gas business. So I think this is, to some extent, the market is doing the work in terms of implicitly taking the cost of capital higher on conventional oil and gas, which will happen. But again, I think a lot is made of, and certainly I think a lot of people are watching. A lot of things are being discussed about federal lands, which is a small piece of the domestic oil and gas business, about 10%. But at the same time, I think, we're seeing acceptance of a lot of the changes, particularly what Starla talked about, and maybe in half measures. But it's just very interesting to us that we're now seeing major oil and gas companies coming out in favor of carbon taxes, of working towards a net zero, certainly before 2050. And again, I think it's going to take a little bit longer to push it to push in that direction. But certainly we're seeing that message is being received, and the industry is working to kind of make that change and find its place. So you have everything from the model you're seeing of the European majors, where they're moving into renewables and power, to some of the smaller independents consolidating and really not trying to grow production. So I think there's a broad swath there, Robert, in terms of addressing. But I think that's what the place of the oil and gas business to think about it is. We're now sitting in an oil market once we're in post-COVID, where global oil demand will probably be somewhere shy of 100 million barrels a day again, if we like it or not, from a policy perspective. And Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States all sit around 10 million barrels a day of that market. So, I think that's not going away in the near term, but certainly a lot of the incentives but not only the market level, but at the policy level will shift for the industry, and the industry is prepared for that.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve. Yes, the summary is, well, the market will adjust as the market has always adjusted. And there are a few points there that I want to pick up in our rotation a little bit later. But first, we want to go to Bethany. Before I hand it over to her, I want two observations. One is, if you joined if you signed up for this program on earlier invitation, we had another panelist. Unfortunately, Erin from Columbia, unfortunately, she had a family emergency, and Bethany was gracious to step in. So thank you very much for that. Bethany is with NYU, and we had, including with the Institute of Policy Integrity, and in on prior panels, we had members of policy integrity join us as panelists 4 years ago, and we talked about energy policy in the Trump administration. It was Janie Hein, and 2 years ago, when we talked about pipelines, it was RV7. But Janie just joined the administration as senior director for NEPA, and Avi became the deputy general counsel of the energy department. So Bethany, we have great hopes for you in the future. And with that, though, I want to, ask some more specific questions. You're a lawyer as well, and you have researched and written about the actual hurdles involved in regulatory attempts. When the Trump administration came in with big, ambitious deregulation goals, it learned quickly that you cannot just undo prior regulations that easily. And now there will be some reality check on creating new regulation. So maybe you can walk us through what that actually means and what you expect in the next few years. And by the way, you're still on mute, so please join us.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I stayed on mute just as long as I needed to. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Danielle and Guarini Center, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thanks for the prompt to talk about sort of what does it take. I'm going to take us a little bit back to the basics to talk about this. These basics proved to be a huge stumbling block for the Trump administration. So I think it's appropriate to talk about them now that we have a new administration trying to do a similar swath of rollbacks. And it's also, appropriate to go back to the basics on a panel that's called Back to the Future. So, what are the basics? So what are the basic rules? There's basically three things. An agency, typically speaking, has to provide the public with notice about what it wants to do, provide us with a proposal about what the plan is and give the public a chance to comment. And I'll come back to, what that means to all of us in a second. An agency needs to have statutory authority for what it's doing. That's how we control our agencies. That's the check we have on agencies that are run by unelected heads. We require them to abide by what Congress said. And then they have to give us a reasoned explanation for what they're doing. And in this era of rollbacks, what that means is that the agency has to grapple with the facts and circumstances that were underlying the prior rule. So right now, that means, what are the facts and circumstances underlying a Trump era rule? For the Trump administration, that was, what were the facts and circumstances underlying an Obama era rule? Ironically, I think it's fair to say that there are some Trump administration rules that had a weak record in comparison to the Obama era rules. So this reasoned explanation hurdle, I don't see this as much of a stumbling block for the Biden administration as it proved to be for the Trump administration. And, I can give you an example for why I say that. The Obama administration issued, for example, the vehicle emissions rule, which improved fuel economy standards and the greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles over time, and produced this record that just showed vast benefits for the American public out of improving these standards. And the Trump administration rolled that back just recently, just last year. And the record shows that the rollback is actually harmful to the American public. So when you've got a record like that you're dealing with as an administration that now wants to roll it back, it might not be as much of a stumbling block to say, now we want to do something that's actually beneficial to the American public. And I've also analyzed all the court cases where Trump era agencies were challenged in court when the Trump administration used agencies to make policy. And it was just, I said it proved to be a stumbling block for the Trump administration to abide by these sort of basic rules. And that's what the numbers show us. The Trump administration had about a 20% win rate in court. And for comparison, the prior administrations had enjoyed a 70% win rate in court when presidents used agencies to make policy. Because it really just takes crossing your T's and dotting your I's and providing an explanation. I don't expect the Biden administration to meet the same fate that the Trump administration met in court, but this is obviously something to watch. How much pushback does the Biden administration get in court, and how does it do in court? And then the other big picture sort of principle that I want to stress right now is this idea of permanency, or this idea of policies that remain in place for long enough for industry to adjust and for the public and industry to have sort of settled expectations for what is expected. And I've done research into this as well with Professor Richard Revesz at NYU, and we're just in a time of extreme volatility when you just have to expect that the future might bring more rollbacks. And so what do you do when you're living through an era of volatility like this? My advice is to issue policies that have a strong and robust record, and to issue them soon. So when we're facing sort of an era of volatility, what agencies need to do then is issue their rules quickly, within the next couple of years. We can't wait until the end of the 4-year term to do these actions that Starla was talking about. They need to come out soon if they're going to stick. And that means they need to get through judicial review. They need to be implemented before there's the chance for more rollbacks, or for something down the line politically to start the volatility cycle again. And that means that this public comment process that I mentioned is crucial. If you're working for a company or at an NGO that wants to sort of support the policy, or wants the policy to be robust and take into account all the important factors, this public comment process is crucial, and it will take everybody. It takes the attorneys general. It takes, states can really help by explaining how these policies play out on the local level. It takes scientists, it takes industry, it takes everybody to play a key role in building records to support policies that will then hopefully be robust and resilient.
Well, thank you, Bethany. Among the panelists, is there anything that any one of you wants to respond to any of the other opening remarks here, or otherwise I'm happy to move it forward with a number of questions for you all. But if one of the to, it's easier when you are in person. When you're looking at the screen, it's harder to be that spontaneous. But if you want to step in by any means, please step in at any time. Maggie, if you're dealing with some of the subject matters that Bethany deals with, if you have any additional perspective on that.
I agree with Bethany's points about record building. And Bethany, I actually do have a question for you as you kind of deal with rollbacks of rollbacks. I think we saw both in the Trump administration, and we may be seeing it right now with the Clean Power Plan, some of this kind of the rise of the zombie rule, right? Where you have a rule that's challenged, and then someone tries to roll it back, and the rollback gets challenged, and it's kind of not really clear what the rule is at any given time. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on sort of how that might change the landscape for energy and how we get to better clarity.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm coming from when I'm talking about rules that are resilient. I would like to see this rollback of the rollbacks and this uncertainty and this volatility end. I'd like to see these rules come out in time for them to be implemented. Once they start getting implemented, then there's settled expectations, and there wouldn't be as much of a political call to roll them back. You'd kind of leave those alone. And that's how we get there. I think that's at least an option for this administration, to just get these rules out, have everybody, work it out so everybody's on board, or that it can get through judicial review in time before there's more political pressure of some kind. And then we won't have the zombie rule era anymore.
One specific question there that just came through the audience. So with the judicial appointment that Trump has made, how will it impact the likelihood of Biden's success, if challenged through the court system? It's a question for Bethany or Maggie.
Do you want to go first, Maggie?
Clearly, we both want to answer this question. I think it's interesting because I think if you look at how Trump appointees have treated Trump's own environmental rules, they have not acted in a overtly political fashion to hold them up. I think that particularly when you're in this space of notice and comment rulemaking, as Bethany detailed, there are sort of very clear procedural rules, and you followed them or you didn't. And the relevant Supreme Court precedent doesn't give courts the ability to substitute their judgment for that of the agency, right? They don't have to find the agency made the best decision or even a good decision. They just have to find that the agency explained their decision. So I don't think that it's going to impact much at the lower levels. I think the interesting question will be, are there members of the reconstituted Supreme Court who are eager to reach back and revisit some of their climate precedents? But I would say in general, we have found that when the court has been presented with those opportunities, they have chosen not to retread that ground in a very dramatic way. And particularly the Roberts Court, he's not been huge on upsetting precedent. So I don't know that it'll make that much difference unless the Supreme Court does something like find a case, climate or not, that is a vehicle to revisit Chevron deference and changes some of the doctrines around how much latitude the agency has to interpret statutory authority.
I want to pick, well, thank you. I want to pick up with a theme that Steve introduced, which is the market is changing already. And it's changing for a reason. The last Lazar analysis of the levelized cost of energy. So Lazar, the investment bank, puts out a fairly comprehensive study pretty much every year of the levelized cost of various types of energy. Levelized means it's reflecting the lifetime of the particular source of energy. And according to the last analysis, the lowest cost energy sources are now utility scale solar and onshore wind on an unsubsidized basis. So comparing the different sources of energy on an unsubsidized basis. So, we hear so much about regulations and what is needed, but is it really needed in light of the fact that the market is already changing? Maybe we'll turn it back to Starla.
Sure, thanks. Yes, regulations and policies are still needed. This is critical as, we've seen a continuing trend of decline, particularly for the costs of renewable technologies, but the prime competitors are, fuel like gas. And there is quite a bit of, and can be quite a bit of volatility in those fuel prices, as we have seen through this pandemic period and previously as well. And that competition is a critical one. And there is certainly a role for policy to play to ensure that through the volatility, the competitiveness of renewable technologies remains and endures. And that is one of the key things. I'll say that one of the most important roles of policy is to make sure that your generation trends and the emission trends are continuing to follow a downward decline, and that continues.
I'll like to jump into on this one. You know, I've noticed for a number of years, the Utility Dive does this annual survey of utility executives. And for years, the regulatory uncertainty has been listed as the single greatest challenge that they face for preparing for what they see as an inevitable market shift towards renewable energy. And what that tells me is that they're looking for certainty in the regulatory framework in order to face the demand and the need to move to this new clean energy world. They're still listing renewables and sustainability in the environment as one of their most pressing challenges in the most recent survey. So, regulations are important for sort of leveling the playing field and making sure that these utility executives can focus on things like innovation and investment and don't have to worry about the changing, the changing whims of the president and can just focus on making progress.
Well, in the utility space, let's not forget that regulations can also be really important in establishing recoverability of costs, right? In many parts of the country now, when you bid out new generation, wind and solar will be cheaper. And so then it's easy to get your PUC, or easier to get your PUC to approve those and allow you to recover them in rate base. But I do think one of the big challenges for a lot of the utilities is when they have these relatively new natural gas fleets, right, in many parts of the country, saying, hey, we haven't used that natural gas plant for as long as we said we were going to use it, dear regulator, but now we'd like to come in and charge our ratepayers more because we want to retire it early and get to wind to address the climate crisis. That can be a tricky thing to do because you have to think about sort of the distributional impacts on the cost of power and some of the equity impacts of that as well. So I think there are some really tricky questions there, and sometimes having that extra regulatory driver of needing to do something to lower your greenhouse gas emissions can make it easier to invest.
Well, it seems like, a common theme of the answers is the pace of the market is not fast enough. So we do need regulation and another, or at least some governmental response. And another one is market has a difficulty with the adjustment when there's uncertainty. Now, a possible way to create that certainty and drive the pace is carbon pricing. So I did a word search of the January 27th executive order, and the word taxes appears 0 times. The word cost appears once. By comparison, the word environmental, or the phrase environmental justice, appears 21 times. And if we want certainty, if we want a faster pace, should the administration push for a carbon tax? Will it push for a carbon tax? What will it take? What would be the obstacles? And I think that's a question that's worth having all the panelists respond to, whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I'll start, considering I didn't weigh in on the last one. I think there's quite a bit of disagreement and different views on carbon taxes. I think most people in the industry, if I think about industry, oil and gas, utilities, and a lot of other emitting industry, Starla mentioned cement and others. Emitters, I think, will generally agree that you need to price this in order to get a price signal into the market, in order to price some of these externalities to offset. I do think that there's a view, and I don't think that there's broad agreement through this new administration on this topic, because from our perspective as well, it just seems as though there's a view that it's not going to be enough. So it can't be the center point of a new policy move. It will be a help, but it's unlikely to be the centerpiece. I agree with your comment, Robert, on taxes, that we haven't had much of the discussion. As I was connecting with our policy analysts in Washington yesterday, and we're ruing about, we're talking about stimulus upon stimulus, and we're going to wait to have a conversation about taxes. But it does seem as though if it's not at least on the carbon side, but haven't really broached the topic of gasoline tax at the pump either, which hasn't been revised up in quite a while. So beyond a conversation about the corporate tax rate. So I do think that there's going to need to be a number of those offsets, but I don't. Our sense is that there isn't broad-based agreement on carbon tax, but we certainly are at a disadvantage relative to some of our European peers who are already pricing this and already moving in this direction. But it seems to us as though it has to be part of a broader kind of solution.
Thanks for that, Stephen. I'll build on that a little bit and just say that in addition to being a part of a broader solution, it cannot supplant or substitute for administrative action and or congressional action even. And in a lot of the analysis that we've done, we've seen carbon taxes or prices drive emissions downward, but not quite to the levels that we are seeing the Biden administration talk about. So it needs to be in conjunction with the regulations and the standards that we have discussed previously here.
Starla, I actually have a question for you around this. There's been a lot going on in DC recently where there have been a lot of concerns raised about the equity implications of a carbon tax and some suggestions that a CES might be better from that perspective. And I know that you guys have done some work on that, so I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's correct. And there are many considerations, of course, with all of these various policy approaches having to do with equity and environmental justice. And certainly carbon pricing is one of them. I think that there are ways and potential carve-outs and exceptions and approaches that are kind of specific to each of these policies that we can add to address a lot of the environmental and environmental justice and equity questions. We've seen in our analysis that, so just as a basic backgrounder, the models that we use to try to represent the electricity sector as well as the economy in projecting the impacts of these policies are not good at directly representing the interests of environmental justice partners and communities because they are usually at much lower geographic resolution. So they do not get to like the local community levels. Very often they do not represent specific plants, for example. So what we've tried to do is to downscale, but also try to build in assumptions into our policies that might address some of these concerns. And they're not necessarily done at the specific local level, but they're meant to approximate it or represent it. And what we've seen is that while a model might produce a result that it calls the lowest cost solution, there are approaches that you can insert to address some of the environmental justice concerns that will move the model off of that lowest cost optimized solution, but doesn't add a lot of cost. So even though we might not get from the model's perspective or from a policy perspective, the lowest cost optimized solution, we can build in considerations to these policies for environmental justice without increasing the cost substantially.
Bethany?
Yeah, I think it's so rational to internalize the external cost of these emissions. It just makes sense. And I think making sure that we do it in a way that's equitable is really key. So I appreciate what Starla just said. That's important.
Well, let me ask about that connection between, you said rational, internalizing externalities, and then we come to environmental justice. And I said before, it's mentioned 21 times. All of that is in the context of what the authors call the climate crisis. But there's only one climate. And so, if the effort is to make it all more scientific, more rational, go about it in an analytical way, why is that environmental justice theme, so prominent across this whole energy policy program here? And that's also, I think, a question that I would really like to pose to all of you.
I mean, there's only one climate, but the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect certain groups, and so it's a crucial part of the solution.
And I'll just add to that as a result, the environmental justice community is obviously a crucial part of the stakeholder universe, because they are going to be the ones most affected. And, in terms of having stakeholder consensus, they will be a critical component.
I think the political piece of this is really important, right? If you look at the broad coalition that the Democrats rallied to elect President Biden, it represents an incredibly diverse set of communities and set of stakeholder interests. And so while climate has been a central motivating factor, both in the campaign and in the early days of Biden administration policy, when you look at the coalition of people who've come together to support this administration, there is a need to recognize the broader set of environmental and justice interests that are at play there. And so, I do think, Robert, it's an interesting academic question, right? I think for many of us, there's been well, it should be climate and climate above all else, because if we fix climate, then we fix all these other problems. But, that doesn't necessarily account for how you're dealing with the transition risk, right? And who can really bear those extra costs in the intermediate period. And that's one of the reasons that I think that the focus on environmental justice is so important. And frankly, I think we see it manifesting a bit even in the corporate world, maybe not expressly called environmental justice, but we've had a lot of really interesting conversations around, do you do just climate, or do you do ESG, writ more broadly, environmental, social, and governance, right? And when you're thinking through that broader lens, it gives you more room to balance in these other priorities, right? I want climate plus justice. I want climate plus, I want people to treat their workers well. I want companies to run themselves well, not just care about climate. And so I do think it all is kind of coming back on each other, but that it is a reflection of the broad coalition that is the Democratic Party right now.
If you have any...
I also wouldn't underestimate, as we're talking about this coalition, and just there's also an international rubric here, right? I mean, there's a palpable sense that that there's been lost time and a desire, at least setting up for Glasgow and what moves forward to reestablish some momentum on the U.S. side. So I think it's part and parcel of the same thing of moving that piece forward. I mean, I think the justice element is certainly, I agree, Maggie, tied into the ESG rubric and what is being asked of corporates and will continue to be asked of corporates. So one only needs to look at Larry Fink's to the BlackRock letters of the last 2 years, and I know you mentioned it off the top, but I couldn't agree any more that just circling back on it, this idea that the SEC and the Fed and corporate disclosure has a place in this conversation that is going to be a completely different look from how policy was implemented and how ends were attempted to be achieved during the Obama administration. I think it's a completely different approach. And as our policy analysts like to say, if there's a cooler head, they haven't found it yet. So there's a clear sense that there's just a willingness to act and a desire to address these issues, not to weigh the alternatives that deliberately at this time.
When in sports events, you come to a point where they announce how big the audience is or how many people are in the stadium. So somebody asked that question. So we are about 130 participants here. Thank you all for joining us. Another question that I would like to pose to all of you that also goes to ambitious goals, how the pace of change and how do we get there? How does nuclear energy fit into this? Yet another word that is in my word search has not appeared. So what do you all think about the future role of nuclear energy, and can we get to carbon-free electricity sector in 2035 without it.
I can maybe start on that one, Robert. I think what's interesting is my research colleagues did a survey of their utility, publicly traded electric utility universe, and I think it accounted for about 80% of the grid in the U.S. And there was a broad view that under the current situation, that 2035 wasn't an achievable goal, and that I think loops back to the need for some additional clarity on policy. And I know that the question is, I don't think nuclear is a huge piece of it. We're building one nuclear plant in the country at the current time. Ultimately, it will get finished, fingers crossed. But it's really not a piece of the forward puzzle. I mean, yes, you'll have the question is, will you put in the rate base to extend some of these facilities, extend their lives? But it's really not what we've seen pretty consistently. And again, I've been covering natural gas markets for, more than 15 years, and was just a consistent, move of coal off baseload, replacing with gas for a decade. And 2017 was the first year that we added more renewables in Texas and California than we retired coal plants. And so, since that time, renewables have been pushing gas to the margin, and we're seeing gas increasingly on a peaker and being used on a reliability basis. So again, I don't think it's a big piece. I don't think it's a big piece of the solution, but I do think you're going to have some one-off situations where facilities will need to be extended to meet the 2035 numbers.
I agree with that entirely. There are lots of scenarios that we have run where in our electricity sector models where nuclear going forward is just not economic. It cannot compete with the other resources that are economic and coming on the grid. I will say that for 2035, there are trade-offs with respect to nuclear and or other resources, and this applies for the longer term too. So, in the event that the nuclear plants retire, it means that there is some other resource that is coming on, whether that is CCS retrofits or new gas with CCS, but obviously those come at a cost premium. So with respect to having baseload electricity sources, there are a range of options. There are trade-offs associated with all of them. There are scenarios where all of them can be viable. It depends on what the policy and economic signals will be.
Maggie or Bethany?
I think the only thing I would add to that is that permitting new nuclear facilities is incredibly complicated, right? So when you look not just at sort of what's your levelized cost of electricity when you actually have a facility built and you can put electrons onto the grid, but more generally, kind of how much uncertainty do you have to live with through a lengthy permitting process, and can you hold your financing together, and will you get your permits, and can you build your facility, and how long it's going to take? That is a real challenge for nuclear right now. Just the relative length of time to permit a facility and get it constructed makes it a less readily available solution if you're talking about new nuclear. I do agree that we will likely see the extension of some existing facilities, but Starla's absolutely right. It's really hard for nuclear to compete on a cost basis right now.
I guess I'll add that, to the extent a state or, whatever entity feels the need to sort of help keep a nuclear facility open to help bridge this gap, then I would like to see sort of rigorous analysis done on the avoided emissions that are brought about by keeping the nuclear facility online. And, there are tools to measure the value of those avoided emissions. It's the social cost of carbon. It's back now with the Biden administration, and, I think it'll be improved. And so I think there's a way to do this in a rigorous and, there's scientific analysis that's available to do this in a way that supports these efforts that I think we should encourage.
Well, you all gave a market answer, right? The market answer is or nuclear, we don't need to think about it. It's not cost effective, but nuclear technology is also changing towards more modular units. And there's probably room for additional change because it hasn't really been the focus of technology innovation. So one, I think, could legitimately ask, well, should that be part, there's always the announcement the government needs to support more, technology innovation in the energy sector, but could that be part of that program to find more modular nuclear technology that is more cost effective? That's a question. I mean, Steve, have you?
Yeah, to be honest, I not something I've done a lot of work on, but I would say one of the things that does come up in this conversation that's interesting to us is the not to turn it a different direction, but is this idea of reliability across grids and in the context of renewables, and we have obviously a lot of growth in stationary power and the lithium-ion batteries, and so we're looking at a situation where we've got rare earth metals that are going to need to be extracted. We've got a lot of battery materials, obviously demand globally, and we're going to have to develop a whole new supply chain. There really is no supply chain for lithium batteries in this country. And it will be a big piece of the backup to these grids if we don't want to continue to have natural gas peakers used, when the sun isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing. So again, I think there's a lot of place for innovation of that, and there's a lot of focus on how do you set up that supply chain. And I wouldn't be surprised to see something. I think Starla mentioned off the top something in terms of EV subsidies, but also you've also got GM and Ford saying that they're going to phase out internal combustion engines, but where the drivetrains and where the battery is going to come from, I think that's a huge area of that will need some support in terms of developing that domestic industry.
Somebody in the audience asked about the current status of the Clean Power Plan. Any one of you want to take that question?
Robert, I'm going to put in the chat a link to an article that a couple of our colleagues wrote explaining that the Clean Power Plan is mostly dead.
I mean, the repeal is definitely dead, so we know that much.
Well,
yeah, I think realistically, right, technically the Clean Power Plan is probably on the books right now because the ACE rule was vacated and remanded. But the next step in the Clean Power Plan would be for the states to develop implementation plans, and it seems likely that the EPA will take some action between now and then to clarify what it wants to do in that space.
Well, if the Clean Power Plan is dead, let's talk about something that's alive, and that seems to be social cost of carbon, or actually more broadly now in the various executive orders, the social cost of greenhouse gases. Can you all kind of comment on that, and particularly what will be the practical significance? Before Trump, social cost of carbon had been on the books for a while. It was sometimes difficult to figure out what difference does it actually make. And there have been very wide estimation of the actual cost of carbon. So going forward with an even broader concept, what will it mean? What is the practical significance? Whoever wants to go first.
I mean, I'm going to jump in on the court front. Having a well-vetted estimate for the damages that we face for each additional ton of greenhouse gas emissions is very useful for agencies. The Obama era agencies used this estimate to analyze the impact of their policies, and it helped in court. The use of this estimate was upheld in court. And then the Trump era agencies tried to use what they called an interim estimate, which the administration said was like an estimate of the domestic only damages, but it really left out like huge amounts of domestic damages. And also it wasn't really interim because we had it for the 4 years. And that hurt them in court. There was a repeal that was based on this interim social cost of carbon number that was struck down in part because the agency had ignored the best available evidence and relied on this unvetted model. And so having something that's well vetted and worked through through public comment and through like an interagency process and where scientists get involved is really, really useful for making sure that agencies can issue these robust, resilient regulations that I was talking about.
And one thing that we are looking forward to at NRDC is a reversal of the Trump era interim estimate where, as Bethany mentioned, they essentially tried to argue that there could be a domestic view of the social cost of carbon, which is really not a domestic estimate, it's a global one, and trying to essentially change the modeling and all of the analytics that goes into developing the social cost of carbon to arbitrarily say that it is a domestic representation is just off the mark and incorrect and inaccurate. So we're looking forward to having a metric that we can use in our studies and before agencies to demonstrate the value of emission reductions. That is a truer representation of those values. I'll also just say that this is a little bit technical, but one of the other things and manipulations that the Trump administration had done was to represent the social cost of carbon with a higher discount rate, which meant that it values the present more than it does the future. But it's NRDC's view that the purpose of the social cost of carbon is to make sure that you are properly valuing the resources and the reduction of carbon emissions to future generations. So we've always been of the position that a lower discount rate should be used, and that makes essentially the value of the social cost of carbon higher, and means that each tonnage reduction of carbon is worth more. So we're looking forward to going back to that era and being able to make estimates and represent the value of policies with those metrics.
So there's one other thing that I think is potentially interesting and to watch for with the Biden administration's use of not just the social cost of carbon, but also the social cost of methane and the social cost of nitrogen. If you look at the executive order that calls for the reestablishment of those, it very clearly contemplates restoring the use of these tools in the kinds of rulemakings that, as Bethany said, are made more defensible when you have this kind of metric in there. But during the Obama administration, there were actually quite a few cases in federal courts that were really going to the question of, does a federal agency, when making a permitting decision, need to apply the social cost of carbon? And there was a lot of debate about whether this is really a tool that's meant for broad economy-wide rulemaking actions, or whether you should apply it at the individual project level. This came up in FERC proceedings too, regularly has. And I think that if you look closely at Biden's executive order, there is at least some suggestion in there of this broader application of the social cost tools to also apply to individual project level decisions. And were that to happen, I think it's yet another thumb on the scale away from projects that have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with them, and not necessarily just in the direct emissions of the project, but are you producing a product that could result in large scope 3 emissions?
Well, let me contrast that with something though. So on one hand, there's this effort to establish a more precise quantitative framework. On the other, for regulatory action. On the other side, there's also a memo on modernizing regulatory review from the president. It says that the review process should also promote policies that fully account for regulatory benefits that are difficult or impossible to quantify. In effect, it's saying As long as it's a regulation, it's good. It doesn't matter, we can quantify the benefits. So how do you contrast those two perspectives? How do you reconcile those two contrasting announcements? Is that the answer?
I mean, I think agencies should value everything they can value. And I mean, that's what's beautiful about the social cost of carbon. It actually allows you to value just one additional ton of greenhouse gases. So it clearly is a very useful tool for project level decisions and would help these agencies doing even small projects to analyze the impact of what they're doing.
There's a specific question from the audience. What sort of policies do you anticipate or hope the administration will implement to support grid scale storage? I think Starla, you had you touched on that in your kind of opening statement. Maybe you have, maybe you want to take that.
Sure. I would start by saying that we view tax credits that include storage technologies as a key component, as well as investment in innovation to develop storage technologies that can take us beyond the 4-hour and 8-hour lithium ion capacities up to seasonal storage and other kinds of technologies and materials that might be able to accomplish that for the grid. I think there's also a role for FERC to develop and implement policies that will value storage and the components of the grid that will help the grid and enable the renewable technologies that are coming aboard. So it's really a multitude of different approaches throughout different agencies and with congressional action and support.
I want to ask a few questions about developments, in energy transition. So energy transition, I think, is the broad term for changes of the energy mix, right? And so within conventional sources, there has been a transition over the last decade or so as well. We witnessed fracking. And with the theme of energy independence, we reduced imports. We started to export crude oil, and going forward, what do you all expect will happen there? How will it be impacted? For example, will the administration on a federal level attack fracking in some form? Will it roll back the export of crude? And then more as a regulatory, as a market matter, not as a regulatory matter, if we do all of that to make the domestic oil and gas production either more difficult or more expensive, directly or indirectly, what will it do to imports? And if we make, for example, if we make it more expensive to transport crude oil from the Permian to a refinery, should that come along with corresponding measures to make imports more difficult? For example, impose import tariffs on export. So it's many facets to that question, and I apologize for that. But again, I would like all the panelists to weigh in on it.
Maybe I'll start on that. I mean, I think that you make a good point. I mean, the real hydrocarbon that we export in size. I mean, we export obviously petroleum products in multiple forms out of the Gulf Coast, but the growth of LNG exports out of the United States has been massive over the last decade. And I think, that there's probably, even in a more constrained development scenario, even in a higher cost of capital scenario, the next phase of projects, it's unlikely that we go from, 10 or 12 BCF a day to 20 BCF a day out of the U.S. But there are a number of projects that are still being contemplated. I think one of the challenges that U.S. LNG has is competitiveness into Europe, particularly relative to Russian pipe gas. And so we've seen, the Qataris sanction the next phase of the North Field expansion just this week. And that's kind of where global supply growth is coming on the gas side. On the product side, I mean, I think like I said before, I think we're going to be almost in an oil market of a certain amount of détente between Saudi, Russia, and the U.S. And essentially, as U.S. supply growth slows, and certainly we think that's slowed for good, I think it's a much more balanced market. And so you don't need to accommodate, the Saudis don't export oil to the Gulf Coast anymore. That's trickled to a stop. And certainly exports have only become an issue to smooth out some seasonality. So I think, like I said, I think that will be less of a factor moving forward. In terms of infrastructure, I would just note, particularly in West Texas, it was, interstate pipes were so easy to build that the industry once again, effectively overbuilt infrastructure. So you've got plenty of infrastructure to get oil from West Texas to Cushing, Oklahoma, or getting it to Houston or Corpus to then either export or process. So I don't think infrastructure build is really the top of the list for what the industry will be focused on in the next in the next cycle. And essentially, if our view on U.S. oil supply being permanently on a lower level, it just won't be as big a demand, at least on the oil side.
Anybody else?
So I will choose to answer the part of your question about banning fracking. Obviously, folks on the line are probably aware that the administration has placed a moratorium on new oil and gas activities on federal lands. But I think it's important to note two things. One is there are some real questions about legally, can you actually ban fracking? There are a number of federal laws that govern how oil and gas leasing works that basically say you'll make a program every 5 years and you will make a plan and you will offer things up for leasing. And so there's definitely some work that would need to be done there if you wanted to get to a full ban. It's also not clear to me that legal controversy would be worth courting for the Biden administration, because I think if you look at some of the other things they're doing, the requests that Interior look at revisiting whether royalty rates are appropriate and thinking about how to incorporate climate impacts into royalties. I think there are some economic or other levers that could be pulled if you did something like adjust the royalty structure that doesn't require a true ban on fracking on federal lands, but would effectively render it uneconomic. I think the other interesting piece of this puzzle when you think about US LNG exports is the question of where they're going and what other types of energy they might be displacing. Right? If you look at many parts of Southeast Asia where there is still a lot of coal being built, there are some arguments that if you're thinking about international climate leadership, that maybe one component of that is some amount of LNG export and building LNG that can be more responsive as you're waiting to build out a renewable grid. I don't know that that's really where this administration is going to go, but there are some arguments that LNG exports can and should be part of that mix, particularly if you're focused on alleviating energy poverty.
Well, one critical component of analyzing the impacts of LNG exports is to really take into consideration the life cycle emissions. So we can't just look at, the emissions of the LNG being burned internationally or globally somewhere else and forget about all of the potential emissions and methane emissions, even in the transport and production, even within the US before it leaves the shores. So that's a critical component that I think is probably not well considered currently, but that NRDC would urge any projects and the government to evaluate.
I'm glad Starla said that. I was going to choose to answer this question by talking about FERC. FERC, I think there's a there's going to be some movement there. I think this is an issue to watch. You know, I think FERC has a role in ensuring that greenhouse gas emissions downstream and upstream are considered when it comes to pipelines, and you know, we've already seen inklings of that from court decisions, and that's an important piece of this puzzle.
There are two audience questions that follow up on our round on the carbon tax. So one is why have we seen oil and gas companies embrace a carbon tax? And the other one is, you know, if there were a carbon tax, which sectors or products do you think are best suited to be targeted by carbon tax? Whoever wants to take it or go first.
I can maybe take the first part. I mean, I think that there's two pieces of why, in certain instances, some companies have been embracing this. One is, I think we've had, I mean, there has been a carbon tax in Canada for more than a decade, and at least initially, you know, industry was supportive because it was carbon intensity instead of absolute, you know, carbon emissions, and so you know, that there was a sense that you were encouraging the industry to take down, if you think about you know, GHG per barrel of production over time, and that I think has been one of the impacts there. But again, it didn't reduce the absolute level of emissions as the industry grew, of course. I mean, I think the other thing, you know, I think a lot of this comes back to one of the earlier questions you asked as well, Robert, which is it's sort of the social cost of carbon. Is I think what we're getting to in the oil and gas business is this idea of kind of social license, and that, you know, traditionally, if you're operating on private land, how you operate is between, you know, you and the landowner. As an oil and gas company, you pay your royalty, you extract your resources, you pay your severance tax, and you meet whatever, you know, regulation, either, you know, EPA or your state oil and gas commission has applied these. So I think the industry is accepting of this idea. I think we'll see more of this, is this social license of saying, well, I have to reclaim the land. And what am I doing with abandonment? What am I doing with, you know, refugee methane emission from existing wells and old wells? Am I putting enough money aside for abandonment liabilities as well? I also think too that there's something, in fact, is that the larger companies could be advocating for a carbon tax because they will be the only ones that will be able to manage it and manage through it. So what it will do is it will shift the industry structure. We've had a very diffuse, very aggressive, smaller oil and gas industry in this country. And that's one of the concerns, probably from the industry perspective, is that you'll have more of this kind of, you know, the smaller operators will have a harder time meeting some of these standards, and it'll be a beneficiary to some of the larger, more consolidated entities.
And I think to build on that point, this is somewhere where I would not discount the importance of ESG and really the social license piece, right? That many of the majors are making commitments to reach net zero, right? And so they have already come out there and made some pretty big statements about what they're going to do on climate policy. And one of the interesting things that we've seen happen in the US after that is we have worked with some clients who have made very public carbon commitments. And then as various rules and regulations come out in the US, they will get calls from their investors. And they'll be like, hey, you know, you said you were really committed to this. And so, you know, we see that the Trump administration is proposing to roll back the methane rules. And we want you to comment in the docket, and we want you to say you're opposed to it, right? Like, investors are actually getting that involved in the day-to-day business and changing the behavior of corporations. I think the other very good point that Steve made that I will underscore is that all actors in the oil and gas industry are not similarly situated. And several of the larger companies who have made these big plans are kind of sitting there saying, we're going to do this and we're going to get to net zero. But they're also saying, well, we could become a company that makes a ton of money off of carbon sequestration if someone would pay us to do that for them, right? And there's only two ways that someone's going to pay you to do that for them. Either they've made their own carbon commitment and they need to pay you more than what it would normally cost for a service so that they can say they bought a net zero barrel of oil from you, or because there's a tax on carbon and it's cheaper to pay you to put it into an abandoned well and prove that it's permanently sequestered than it is to go buy allowances on the market.
Well, we have a few minutes left. I would like to circle back to the very beginning when Starla opened our discussion here. And it kind of conforms also to an audience question that came through here. So Starla, you started off by outlining, some of the actions that you think are necessary: power, the power sector, FERC, pipelines, and all of which. Or maybe that's unfair, but much of which has to do with making it more difficult for oil and gas or fossil fuels to go from the source to the end user. But we haven't talked about the end user, and it's unfair to pick on you, but you're sitting in a house in New Hampshire, and it's heated with something. And so where's the end user here? What would be actions necessary to change energy consumption in households, residential heat, air condition, and individual transportation, and what will it cost the end user?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And that is definitely a critical component of, the suite of changes that we are discussing. I think that there is certainly a very strong role for policies to address the challenges and to shape consumer behavior, and really try to make the economics work out so that there is an incentive for consumers to want to switch homes to the electricity powered heat pumps and water heaters, and for them to purchase electric vehicles. There also needs to be the infrastructure opportunity in place for that to happen. So through a range of federal and state incentive structures, we believe that there is the ability to put in place the policies needed to make these changes. They're extremely ambitious, and the levels that we are looking at that are needed to really meet net zero by 2050 goal, and even be in a position in 2030 to be able to meet that 2050 goal is quite staggering. That there's no way around that. But part of this, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is the kind of broad social license that will need to be in place to make these changes.
Any other last words of wisdom?
I wanted to say something about a different federal agency, the Department of Energy. I think it's another one to watch. They have energy efficiency standards that are really powerful and important. And, state AGs had to sue the Trump administration to make sure that they got finalized and published. But there was a lot of movement on that front, thanks to our states. And I think that's another place where we can watch for, market shifts and, regulations spurring things that are good for the public.
Well, we have reached the hour. So thank you all meaning all the panelists and all the participants. Thank you, Danielle, for coordinating it. And thank you for those in the audience who have submitted questions. So thank you all, and all I can say is that I hope that next year's event will be in person, and as great as it was. And I just want to turn it back to Danielle to close the session. Thank you all. Danielle, you are muted.
I broke the cardinal rule of Zoom. But I did want to thank you once again, Robert, for leading us in such a fascinating conversation. Thank you to all our panelists for your insights. And thank you to the audience. I look forward, as Robert said, to seeing you all in person very soon, and wish you a very pleasant evening.
Yeah, here's a suggestion for the panel next year. What actually happened in that year? You know, same topic, but we'll look at what has changed. So let's pick up on that next year. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Good
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.